want to welcome Dr. Tim Brauner and to the stage again, because he already shared lots of the case study about the simulation during these days. So welcome, Dr. Tim.
Thank you.
Yeah, as we mentioned before, simulation is a key technology for product and design. So that's why ZWSOFT have the Phoenix and also the ZWCAD structure to help the designer to save hundreds of hours and to avoid the malfunction before the products released to the market. So as the Dr. Tim did the presentation yesterday, we are talking about the electronic cooling system on a system level, but it's quite a small system. So today we want to scale it up and to talking about the electronic cooling system on a data center. So we are interested to hear about the case study sharing from the Dr. Tim. So welcome.
Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for attending this talk. My name is Timothy Brauner. I'm a computational fluid dynamics engineer at Concentration, Heat and Momentum, or CHAM for short. And I've spent the last 10 plus years studying and working in the field of computational fluid dynamics. I've now been at CHAM for almost 7 years. My talk today is going to first very briefly touch on CHAM's background and our recent acquisition by ZWSOFT, before then presenting an example of a data center cooling case using our CFD product, Phoenix. One of the motivators for this study is that data center power usage is forecast to increase by about 10% year on year for the next 10 years. So that's more than doubling. That's about 2.6x. What's driving this is stuff like cloud adoption, and there's a huge demand for AI-related compute. This is coupled with an increase of power density, which we're seeing with ever-increasing node sizes in silicon, and power density in devices and power use of these devices. So it's therefore very important to understand how to handle the cooling, how to keep the devices running efficiently, and how to have all parts that are involved run efficiently. So not just the individual components, but all the system level, but also the data center that houses everything together. So we're going to see how we can do this and gain this detailed understanding through CFD. So a quick overview of what I'm going to be doing is a quick word on CHAM and ZWSOFT. I'll then introduce the model problem, which is the data center room of which an illustration is shown on the right-hand side of the screen. I'll then discuss the features of the room and the information that is required in order to set up a CFD problem. We'll then take a look at the results from the CFD and what they tell us about the system. And finally, we'll talk about some findings that are suggested by the results, and we'll look into some changes that we might need to implement in order to fix any potential problems. So a brief history about us. Concentration, Heat and Momentum is a CFD consultancy and software house with its own CFD software package. CHAM was founded by Professor Brian Spalding of Imperial College in 1974. We're based in Wimbledon, London, and CHAM can be considered the birthplace of commercial CFD. One of the main, not one of our main product is called Phoenix, which is a general purpose computational fluid dynamics software. When Phoenix was initially released in 1981, it was the first commercially available general purpose CFD software. And we've been developing it further ever since. But not only do we develop it, we also sell it. We use it ourselves for consultancy projects, and we pride ourselves in providing first-class user support. In October of last year, CHAM was acquired by ZWSOFT, and we joined the ZWSOFT family. ZWSOFT has been expanding into many different fields, but until the acquisition of CHAM, computational fluid dynamics was not yet a part of the portfolio. So that's what we're bringing to the game. For me, as part of the CFD team, it's very exciting because our CFD team has now doubled in size, and we are working very hard on improving the product Phoenix, but also on bringing computational fluid dynamics into ZWSOFT's environment. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing where this partnership takes us. So let's take a look at the test case. This is a representation, a simplified representation of the geometry of the model that one of our customers came to us with for some support. So data centers are not typically challenging due to their geometry. They are challenging because of their layout and the various things that make up the data center, and also the many, many components within one that actually affect the flow of air. So the main focus of this room are the server racks. They're shown in dark green. The racks are divided into 4 groups and 2 rows each. And of these 2 rows face in opposite directions, which means they draw air in from the room and they expel it into a common aisle. And this aisle is shielded from the room, and you can see this in the light blue or pale green. So this hot air now needs to go somewhere. It goes up into the ceiling. This is typically known as hot aisle containment, which is a technical term in the data center area. So the other components in this room around the edges we see in blue and red are air handling units, sometimes also referred to as computer room air handling units or CRACs. And there are also power delivery units shown in orange on the rear wall. So the operating principle that is supposed to be used in this room is to exploit the fact that hot air tends to rise and that cool air tends to fall to the ground. And so with this in mind, the room has been divided into 3 regions. There's the underfloor, in which the cold air is handled. There is the room in which all the devices are present. And then there is a plenum chamber above the ceiling in which hot air can flow through. The air handling units draw the hot air from the ceiling through their internals, where the air is cooled, and they issue the cold air under the floor. A particular feature of this data center is that the power distribution units that were chosen do not connect to the ceiling. This was a restriction that the designers had to adhere to due to some infrastructure constraints, which meant that they could only have the units on the far wall, and they needed to be situated close together in order to accommodate their size. So they just issued their waste heat into the room, which is something that we'll look into in a little bit. So in an attempt to deal with this hot air that goes into the room from the power delivery units, the designers decided to put venting in the ceiling. And this venting was supposed to allow the hot air to rise up into the ceiling. They were hoping that also the suction from the air handling units would promote this effect. And we will see in detail what happens from the CFD. So what would we like to know? What else would we like to know from the CFD is how well can this cooling system handle the power dissipation that is required by the heat generated from the racks? And in particular, we want to know what the 3D effects are. So we know that we know how much heat is produced by the racks, and so we know how much needs to be dissipated, but this doesn't necessarily account for the 3-dimensional effects that can happen in a velocity field. So in order to capture any geometry in our simulation, we use something called a cut cell method, which cuts the geometry out of our Cartesian background mesh. Any cut cells are then treated with a specialized formulation. From the manufacturing specs of the equipment, we know that there are high velocities in the simulation domain, so we know that our simulation is turbulent, and we will include a turbulence model. We're going to also solve a temperature equation, but for this purpose, or for the purpose of this study, we're only going to solve the temperature equation in the air. We're not interested for now in the temperature of the solids. That could be a follow-up simulation. So in order to account for hot air rising and cold air sinking, we're also going to be including a density model. For the air handling units and the power delivery units, we need to specify things like mass flow rate and added heat or removed heat, which we get from the data center or component manufacturing data sheets. For the servers, we need to set things like porosities because they contain different types of hardware. They offer different resistances to the flow, and we also need to specify how much heat is rejected by them. Okay, so let's take a look at some results. The little image here on the left is to try and help visualize the data slice that we are looking at on the right and where it is located in the room. So right now we're in the underfloor. We're looking underneath the floor, a region that we would not otherwise be able to see because it's covered. So this one is the velocity magnitude under the floor. and we see that it is not particularly evenly distributed. We see that there are jets coming from the air handling units, and that these jets meet in the middle of the room under the floor. We also see that there are swirling regions. We see these in dark blue, and these typically correspond to some negative pressure regions, which is not what we would like to see as a data center designer under the floor. So actually, we would like to see very uniform flow, and instead the CFD tells us that we're seeing chaotic and rotating flow regions under the floor. So this is now the same plot as the previous one, but we're looking at pressure under the floor. And so we see that where the jets collide, there is a high pressure. However, there are also those low pressure regions in the rotating parts of the flow that I mentioned just now. So a high pressure would help push air up through the floor vents into the server room, and low pressure could lead to preventing that from happening. So now with changing the slice that we're looking at, we're now looking at a side-on view of the room with a cut through all the servers. I hope in the little image in the top left you can see where this plane is located. Here we see the three zones of the model: the underfloor, quite clearly, the room, and the ceiling plenum. We can also see that the hot aisle containment is affecting the pressure. Each of the pair of rows of racks is exhausting into the same aisle, and when one tries to force a lot of air into the same space, the pressure increases a little bit like when you're blowing up a balloon. So we see here that there are also some rotating regions under the ceiling. So now let's take a quick look at the temperature. This is now a plane in the room rather than on the floor, and it's about 1 meter above the ground. So most of the room looks like it's filled with cold air, which is what we would like to achieve. However, along the right side, we see that on the wall near where the power delivery units are, that there are regions of warm air. In the top right, we can see that there's a dark red region as well, which is inside one of the hot aisle containment parts. This indicates that there is a server that is running hotter than it would be expected, and this is likely due to the warm air that is in front of the server. So this means that that entire row really is not being able to cool down as effectively as the designers might desire. So let's see if we can find out what's happening here and why this is taking place. So this is another view from the side, but now we're looking at the temperature. We can see that on the right, there is hot air from the ceiling chamber entering down into the room. And this is exactly the opposite of what the designers had intended. So this suggests that the design with hot air being driven up through buoyancy and suction from the air handling units is not working. Instead, we have the hot air rising up into the ceiling, but instead it's being pulled down into the room. So this is likely due to two things. One, the suction from the racks is very strong, and the pressure from the ceiling is higher than the pressure in the room. So let's take a closer look at this part of the plot on the right. So I've changed the plot limits from the previous plot, but otherwise it's still a pressure plot. And we can see that the top region, the ceiling plenum chamber, is mostly sort of green and light blue, indicating here a low pressure. But the room below is actually dark blue, indicating an even lower pressure. And when you have a high pressure, or in relative terms, a high pressure next to a low pressure region, the flow will always tend to want to move from high to low. We're also seeing that there's a very low pressure under the floor. And this is one of the rotating regions that we saw earlier. So this will tend to prevent air from moving upwards from under the floor as well, which in turn could encourage more hot air to be drawn in from the ceiling. So what are the findings that the CFD tells us about this particular configuration of the data center? We've seen that there are opposing jets under the floor, and that these tend to be unsteady, chaotic, and can cause rotating regions. There are also rotating regions in the ceiling, but these did not seem to be linked to any issues. We also found that the design to let hot air from the PDUs rise up to the ceiling by buoyancy and suction is not working. Instead, we found that this makes the temperature in the room worse because hot air is instead pulled down into the room. So what could we possibly do about this issue? It will be necessary to redesign the connection of the PDUs to the ceiling plenum. Most likely, they will need to remove the vents and introduce ducting that will lead the hot air straight up into the ceiling rather than issuing it out into the room. This could, however, prove difficult because the power units are packed so densely and there is little room for ducting. It would be useful to introduce baffles and obstructions under the floor, possibly to prevent the recirculating regions, but this didn't seem to be the main problem. This is a lot of information to digest, and we've only done one simulation so far, but it's been able to show us that there is an issue with the design, and interpreting the CFD results has allowed us to be able to identify what the problem is, and we have obtained more information about the flowing system, and we've been able to diagnose the issues thanks to these insights that we've gained. So data centers are not the only things where this sort of study can be performed. A very similar thing could be performed on a workshop, on a clean room, in laboratories, sometimes in hospital pharmacies, places where laminate airflow units are working. So I hope that this has given a little bit of an insight into how CFD or single CFD simulation can help identify issues with a data center design. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me or come join me at the laptop afterwards. We have the model here and we can look at it in 3D and explore more of the solution. So thank you very much for your attention.